Today, the rust and concrete don't tell the story, but not long ago, this was the site of a triple murder. Before the cozy family home turned to ashes, Becky Friedly, her mother Vicki Friedly, and Vicki's boyfriend John Hayward lived in this remote area called Pinyon Pines. The family used to joke that the place was so far from the nearest neighbors that you could step onto the porch and scream at the top of your lungs, and no one would ever hear you. Now that doesn't seem like a joke. If anyone screamed that night, no one heard. Only the wailing sirens of emergency vehicles hours later. 3 lives were reduced to ashes in a single night. The killer left no clues behind. The fire that consumed the crime scene erased everything. It took 12 painfully long years to bring this case to trial and to its emotional conclusion. On the night of September 17, 2006, the wailing sirens of emergency services echoed over California's Coachella Valley. They were racing toward the home of 53-year-old Vicki Friedly, where she lived with her boyfriend, 55-year-old John Hayward, and her 18-year-old daughter, Becky Friedly. When firefighters extinguished the flames, they discovered the bodies of Vicki and John inside the house, but they hadn't died in the fire. Both had been shot. As the medical examiner later determined, Vicki had been shot in the head with a .40 caliber handgun, while John had been struck in the chest with a shotgun blast. The remains of the third victim, Becky, were found outside in plain sight just in front of the house. Her charred body lay inside a still smoldering wheelbarrow. The burns were so severe that determining her exact cause of death was impossible. This house in the mountains, high above the scorching heat of the Coachella Valley, was built by Ron Friedley, Vicki's ex-husband, with his own hands. When they got married, Vicki already had a daughter from a previous relationship, Tiffany. Ron chose this remote location because he loved the idea of raising children and living as a big family far from the noise of the city. During their marriage, they had 3 more daughters, Tanya, Drew, and Becky. The youngest of the sisters was Becky Friedly. A kind and cheerful girl, she was always at the center of attention. Wise beyond her years, she often helped her older sisters with chores, despite being several years younger. Overall, she was a happy and lively child. Ron adored his daughters, and so did Vicki. She was a kind-hearted woman who loved home life, gardening, sewing, and cooking healthy, delicious meals for her children. Their happy family life lasted 13 years before Ron and Vicki divorced. However, they remained on good terms. Their marriage had simply evolved into friendship rather than a romantic partnership. As time passed, the older daughters left home. Tiffany had moved out long ago. Tanya became a sheriff's deputy in another city. Drew joined the Air Force as a medic and was stationed at a base in Japan at the time. Becky was the only one still living with their mother. She was finishing high school and working as a waitress at a local restaurant called Danny's. Before long, Vicki found love again with a contractor named John Hayward. They bonded quickly over their shared love of the outdoors and enjoyed their secluded home away from civilization. John's daughter was surprised by their choice and often urged them to move to the city. But John would always reply that their home was peaceful, no one ever bothered them, and it was the safest place he could imagine. And then came that fateful September night. At first, no one could imagine who would want to harm John, Vicki, and Becky. Rumors began to spread that the crime was committed by someone who held a grudge against Ron Friedly. Vicki's ex-husband and Becky's father had retired just a year earlier from the Riverside County Sheriff's Office. However, Ron himself didn't believe this theory. Throughout his career, he had never crossed paths with someone so dangerous and vengeful that they would seek revenge by murdering his family. The investigators quickly dismissed that theory, but soon rumors began to circulate about Ron himself. The police didn't hesitate to question one of their own. After all, Ron had built that house in the mountains with his own hands, and now another man was living there with his family. He could have had a motive for resentment. Ron answered all their questions, and then they asked him to take a polygraph test. That was the moment he truly felt like a suspect. However, he passed the test with flying colors. On top of that, he had a solid alibi. A review of his phone records confirmed that he was 11 hours away from the crime scene at his home in Northern California. The police officially ruled Ron Friedly out as a suspect. In the first days after the murders, Ron found himself asking questions he couldn't answer. Who could have done this? Who would have wanted to harm Vicki, John, and Becky? But once the initial shock wore off, Ron looked at the crime from an investigator's perspective, and he came to a chilling conclusion. The primary target had been Becky, as unbelievable as it seemed. What was even more unsettling was that the detectives working the case agreed with his theory. The wheelbarrow where Becky's remains were found had been moved closer to the house. It originally stood much farther away. Someone had placed her inside, wheeled her to that spot, and set her body on fire in a deliberate, almost theatrical display. They had even doused her with an accelerant to ensure the message was clear. Becky was the one they had come for. And then there was another disturbing detail. Becky had been terrified of fire. When she was very young, her mother had been cooking tacos in a pan full of hot oil set on the stove. Becky accidentally pulled it down, suffering third-degree burns across her chest. Anyone who knew her well was aware of both the scars and her deep fear of fire. So who was the monster that had hunted her down? While Ron and Becky's older sisters struggled to think of anyone who might have wanted to harm her, the people who saw and spoke to Becky every day knew exactly who was responsible for the triple murder from the very start. One of them was her friend, Jeannie McDaniel. The moment she heard what had happened, she immediately thought of Becky's ex-boyfriend, Robert. Robert Pape and Becky Friedly had started dating in high school and had been together for over a year. At first, they seemed happy. Becky was head over heels for him. But first impressions were deceiving. Before long, Robert's jealousy and controlling nature became impossible to ignore. He struggled to hide it. For example, 10 months before Becky's death, she and Jeannie went on a trip, and Robert called Becky 20 to 30 times in a single evening, demanding that she talk to him instead of spending time with her friends. Her phone rang every few minutes. His control over her became unbearable. Even Becky, who had once loved him, had had enough. In January 2006, they broke up and started seeing other people. But instead of moving on, Robert's behavior only became darker, more disturbing. Just 3 weeks before the fire, Becky had come to Jeannie once again, complaining about her ex. She told her Robert wouldn't leave her alone, that he had even threatened to kill her. He couldn't accept their breakup, and he definitely couldn't stand the idea of her being with someone else. Yet Becky spoke about it as if it were nothing, just a childish tantrum that would soon pass. Jeannie wasn't too worried at the time, but the moment she heard that Becky and her family hadn't died in a fire, but had been murdered, she went straight to the sheriff's office. But here's the interesting part. This wasn't the first time investigators had heard Robert's name. Another friend of Becky's, Javier Garcia Jr., came forward with crucial information. On September 17th, the night of the murders, Becky had planned to go on a hike in the mountains near her home with Robert and his friend, Kristen Smith. Most likely, she had agreed to go, hoping to have one last conversation with Robert, to make him understand once and for all that they were over. She wanted to end things on a friendly note. As the investigation quickly zeroed in on two suspects, the families of Becky, Vicki, and John were confident that justice would soon be served. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Just as quickly as things had escalated, the case came to a screeching halt. Robert and Kristen were questioned and released. The police and prosecutors refused to share any details with the victims' families or the public. They simply repeated the same phrase: there isn't enough evidence for an arrest. Despite interviewing countless people, the investigation made no progress, and within a year and a half, it completely stalled. Luis Bolanos, a former colleague and close friend of Ron Friedley, watched helplessly as Ron slipped into despair. The two had met years earlier at the sheriff's office. Ron had first been Luis's mentor, then his friend. Now it was Luis's turn to help. He begged Ron to let him take on the case, convinced that they could bring attention to it and reignite public interest. But Ron had faith that the sheriff's office would solve the case. However, as the 6th anniversary of the murders approached, that faith was gone. He finally gave Luis the green light. Luis threw himself into the case, accomplishing more in a few months than the police had in years. His first move? A highly provocative billboard. It featured a bright, smiling photo of Becky, right next to a simulated image of her burned body in the wheelbarrow. Then he held a press conference at the crime scene alongside Becky's older sisters, Tanya and Drew. It sent shockwaves through the community. Over the next year, tips started pouring in. But for Luis, it still wasn't enough. Determined to bring even more attention to the case, he teamed up with a filmmaker to create a chilling reenactment of that September night. Based entirely on police reports, the video was disturbingly realistic, and it worked. Luis received over 3,000 calls, and they all pointed to Robert. So Luis decided to go straight to the source. He approached Robert under the guise of interviewing former classmates of Becky. But when he asked about her, Robert, who had dated Becky for nearly a year and even attended prom with her, claimed he couldn't remember anything about her. The investigation picked up pace much faster when Becky's cousin, Daniela Zermeno, contacted Luis. The young woman explained that she had spoken with her sister on the phone on the night of the murder. Becky had mentioned that Robert Pop came to visit her at the restaurant where she worked, and he wasn't alone. He was with his friend Christian. The young man caused a scene, arguing with her, and making threats. To get them to stop attracting attention and leave, Becky promised to go on a hike with them in the mountains. This confirmed what Becky's friend Javier had said about her plans to walk with the guys. What's most interesting is that as soon as Daniela heard about her cousin's death nearly 7 years ago, she immediately passed on the details of this conversation to her mother, who then told the investigators everything. However, Daniela was never questioned. Luis asked her to go to the police herself and repeat her statement. Finally, 7 years after the triple murder, Paul E. Zellerbach, who was the district attorney at the time, believed it was time to move the case forward. Robert and Christian were initially supposed to face a grand jury. As the victims' families rejoiced that there were finally changes in the case, 2 other families were convinced that 2 innocent men had been wrongfully accused. The 25-year-old men denied their guilt. Naturally, they hoped that the grand jury would not proceed with the case. They didn't fit the usual profile of suspects. Neither had a police record. Both were married, and Christian was about to become a father. Robert had started dating his wife Sarah after breaking up with Becky. According to their families, Robert loved animals and was always willing to help his loved ones. He was a law-abiding citizen and a churchgoer. Christian had realized his dream of serving his country in the military. He fought in Afghanistan and was awarded 2 Purple Hearts. Therefore, supposedly, he couldn't be a killer. Christian's father even stated, "My son saved lives in Afghanistan. He doesn't take lives. He saves lives." Such naive simplicity. Although Christian had become a national hero by the age of 25, investigators were convinced that at 17, he had committed the murder with his best friend, 18-year-old Robert. In high school, they were best friends, though their friendship was strange, almost like an addiction. Individually, they were just ordinary guys, but together, they became uncontrollable. The guys had an unusual fascination with fire. Becky, who was afraid of fire, didn't like their activities and often complained to her friends about her boyfriend. The men's families insisted this was untrue, but Robert's own words contradicted them. Just a few months before the fire in Pinyon Pines, Robert had been texting Sarah, his future wife, offering a solution to her problems with her ex-boyfriend. "If you know where he lives, we can professionally burn his house down," he wrote. Sarah replied that he was a known pyromaniac. Considering how Becky, Vicki, and John died, that message, written 8 months before the murders, now feels chilling. When the grand jury began hearing the case, Robert and Christian invoked their right to remain silent and not testify against themselves. But when the police interrogated them years earlier, both denied being near Becky's house that night or even planning to go on a walk with her. They claimed they were heading to church in the evening, but supposedly had the idea to call the church on the way there and realized it was closed. They then returned to Christian's house to play video games. After that, they went to a local school to shoot paintball guns, but no one saw them there. In essence, their only alibi was their own word. But the biggest suspicions arose from the phone activity of the 2 men that night. They claimed to have been on the other side of town, but their phones indicated otherwise. At 7:13 p.m., Robert's phone was near the beginning of the highway leading to his ex-girlfriend's house. A few minutes later, both Robert's and Christian's phones stopped showing any activity. From 7:30 p.m. to 10 p.m., the phones were not used, which was exactly the time frame when the investigators believed the murders occurred. As already known, Becky was attacked behind her house near the desert. She was then placed in a cart, taken to the house, and set on fire. 60 meters north of the house where the killers had pushed the cart, the police found a business card. DNA from Christian was found on the card. The autopsy revealed that Vicki was shot in the head with a .40 caliber handgun. John was killed with a shotgun blast to the chest. When the police searched the men's homes, officers found shotguns similar to the one used in the murder. No handguns were found, but Robert's house contained ammunition for a .40 caliber pistol and a holster for a Glock 40. Investigators were convinced that Robert and Christian were the killers, but the defense attorneys had counter-arguments prepared. First of all, they claimed that by the time of Becky's murder, Robert had already forgotten about her because he was dating Sarah. He never went to Becky's work to have an argument, and his suggestion to burn down a house in his text to Sarah was a joke, and those words were taken out of context. Christian, they argued, had no motive for the crime. What kind of person would help a friend kill his ex-girlfriend and her family, who had done nothing to him, just because his friend asked? Christian's attorney argued that it was simply absurd. Additionally, just 3 minutes before Robert's phone appeared near the highway, Christian's phone had connected to a tower several kilometers away. However, FBI experts explain that, on higher ground, mobile phones sometimes connect to different towers. As for the business card, Christian insisted that he had never been to the Friedly family's house. His attorney echoed this, claiming that Becky had dropped the card herself. The men's lawyers pointed out that there were other people whose actions raised far more suspicion. First and foremost, Becky's best friend, Javier Garcia Jr., who was the one to initially steer the investigation toward Robert and Christian. In reality, it wasn't a secret that he wanted to be more than just friends with Becky, but she didn't feel the same way about him. And while Robert's and Christian's phones weren't directly linked to the crime scene, Javier's phone was very close to her house. He explained that he had been heading to her house because he wanted to join the group for the hike in the mountains, but Becky had told him not to come. So he simply turned around and went home. The police tracked his movements and confirmed that he had returned home. At the time of the crime, he was several kilometers away from the Friedly family's house. His name was then removed from the list of suspects. Robert and Christian were already preparing for their preliminary hearing when, 6 months after their arrest, an unexpected turn of events occurred. The prosecutor entered the courthouse and requested that all charges be dropped against them. He vaguely explained his decision, citing legal technicalities. And just like that, the men were released. But the reason behind the charges being dropped might have been quite intriguing. One of the men's attorneys called the district attorney, Paul Zellerbach, as a witness. This was unprecedented, yet Paul Zellerbach never gave his testimony. He was scheduled to appear in court on Monday, but on Friday, just before that, the charges against the men were dropped. But why was he even called to court? According to Luis, this had something to do with the upcoming election campaign, during which Paul Zellerbach wanted to be re-elected for a second term. An incident, though not directly related to the murders, but one that influenced the outcome of the case, occurred. Paul Zellerbach was caught on video tearing down election posters of his opponent. He was arrested and charged with a minor offense. But what was most surprising was that the person who filmed it was Javier Garcia Sr., the father of Becky's best friend, Javier Garcia Jr. Paul explained that Javier's father had been following him and trying to capture something incriminating because he was upset that Paul had refused to grant immunity to his son. Javier Garcia Jr.'s lawyer had asked for the district attorney to officially confirm that Javier wasn't a suspect in the case, but Zellerbach had refused. According to the district attorney, this refusal had led the boy's father to act against him. However, amidst the political circus, the fact that 3 people were brutally murdered in their own home and no one was held accountable got lost. Fortunately, everything changed with the election of a new district attorney, Michael A. Hestron, in 2014. He was ready to take the case forward again. The first thing investigators did was revisit the evidence against the men using advanced technologies. They, in particular, re-examined the business card with Christian's DNA on it. Over the years, DNA analysis technology had progressed significantly, and it now almost certainly confirmed that the DNA on the card belonged to Christian. Another incriminating piece of evidence was a recording of phone calls made by Robert from jail after his first arrest. He and his wife Sarah discussed the need to hide unregistered firearms, including a .40 caliber pistol, the same caliber used to kill Vicki Friedly. Additionally, the police had a new witness. He had spoken with Christian shortly after the triple murder, and Christian confessed to him. Christian told the witness that everything had gone so wrong that night, and events developed so quickly that he and Robert had to burn everything to the ground. In June 2016, Robert and Christian were arrested again. The new prosecutor, Michael Hestron, also apologized to the victims' families for the previous handling of the case by law enforcement. The trial began in April 2018, almost 12 years after the murders. For the families of the victims, it was difficult to hear the details of the murders and to see that the one responsible was someone Becky had once loved. This was especially painful. The trial lasted about a month, after which the jury deliberated for 10 days. The men were found guilty of first-degree murder of Vicki and John. Robert was convicted of second-degree murder for Becky. Initially, Robert faced the death penalty, and Christian was sentenced to life in prison, but ultimately both were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The jury finally determined who was responsible for the deaths of 3 people in Pinyon Pines. However, the remnants of the devastation from that dreadful night still linger. What the victims' families saw as just punishment for the murderers, Christian and Robert's families viewed as a terrible injustice. After the verdict was delivered, their relatives were crushed, but perhaps the young men should have thought about this before barging into someone else's home with weapons, shooting innocent people, and then burning their bodies with accelerant. No one's life should end that way, especially the life of a young, vibrant woman who was afraid of fire. Clearly, you can be a brave soldier, a churchgoer, a loving husband and father, and the best friend to those close to you, while skillfully hiding the fact that, at 17, you turned into a heartless killer.